TV.
Movies!
Hey Matt, wanna hear a story?
Okay.
Cool. So there's this guy, and this guy, he has a balloon that he puts up over the city of New York. It's just a plain balloon with nothing on it. It could be any size or shape, it could be any color, red, green, blue, orange, or white. The point is, he puts it up over New York City, and soon, everybody starts to notice it. The balloon stays over the city for several days, and people begin to judge their location based upon their relative position to it.
I'm 3 blocks south of the balloon.
Everybody reacts to the balloon differently. Some people love it, some people hate it. Many are confused by it, but everyone has an opinion. Some people believe it would be better if the balloon had something written on it, like an advertisement. At least then the meaning would be clearer. Even the government gets involved, trying to pull it down out of the sky to study it. They are unsuccessful. The critics at every major publication in the city soon get wind of this balloon, and every one of them has something to say about it. The man who put the balloon up in the sky eventually pulls it down, and though people are initially confused by its absence, they quickly move on with their lives. We then find out in the final moments of the story that the man who put it up there did so as an expression of anguish over missing his girlfriend, who was away in Norway. Upon her return, he pulls it out of the sky, deflates it, and stores it away for another time of such anguish. This is the story of the balloon by Donald Barthelme, which was first published in The New Yorker in 1966. The balloon is fairly typical of Barthelme's usual body of work, as it uses a deceptively simple story to explore the various conventions and boundaries of the medium that he was working in this case, fiction.
So it's not just about the balloon.
No, it's not. In fact, the balloon is essentially a metaphor for a work of art. Now, this could be a general work of art, like a painting, or a sculpture, or a novel, or a movie. Or it could be symbolic of the story itself. It was no mistake that the story is named after its central symbol. The balloon goes through much of the same journey as a work of art does when it's released to the public. Some people love it, some people hate it, others try to study it and censor it, and many are confused by it. And then there's the critics. Whenever a work of art is put out into the world, every major publication and solo critic with a platform has something to say about it. This is one of the more satirical sections of the story as well, as many of the hacky lines all read like things that we've heard a million times on various criticisms of work of art, and heck, some of them might have even been criticisms that Barthelme had gotten on his own work.
Okay, what about the end though, where he takes the balloon down and puts it away? Artists don't really do that with their work.
Well, that's where the balloon could be interpreted as the creative spark that drives art. Barthelme seems to be at least somewhat arguing that art is created out of personal expression, in this case of anguish, and by putting the balloon up there, the artist is creating some kind of art. And once that anguish is no longer present and his creative fuel has been satisfied, then he takes his creativity, bottles it up inside, and saves it for later.
Okay, so this whole thing was just because he missed his girlfriend? That's why he did it? That's the whole explanation for it?
Maybe, but then again, maybe not. You see, Barthelme was a postmodernist, and that's a loaded term if I've ever heard one. There are so many conflicting definitions of postmodernism, but the most common ones generally seem to think that the common theme of postmodernism is a skepticism towards universal truths, and also an examination and deconstruction of usual ideas and tropes. Encyclopedia Britannica defines postmodernism as a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, as well as a general suspicion of reason. Essentially, in postmodernism, nothing is certain. In fact, since the entirety of the story of the balloon is essentially people giving their various interpretations of what this balloon up in the sky could possibly mean, the fact that the very last paragraph of the story has the author of the balloon coming in and explaining what he truly meant about the story, essentially saying, no, you're wrong, This is what it means. It kind of makes that little coda feel like something of an ironic joke. The whole story, we're playing with this distinctly postmodern idea of various infinite interpretations of this work of art, and then for the end to come down to essentially authorial intent? That seems a little disingenuous to me. In fact, just before the narrator reveals that he created the balloon out of an expression of anguish over lost love, we get this other interpretation, one that's given more space and that feels a little more genuine. The text reads, "It was suggested that what was admired about the balloon was finally this, that it was not limited or defined. Sometimes a bulge, blister, or subsection would carry all the way down to the East River on its own initiative. Then that part would be thrown back again, or would withdraw into new dispositions. This ability of the balloon to shift its shape, to change, was very pleasing, especially to people whose lives were rigidly patterned, persons to whom change, although desired, was not available. The balloon, for the 22 days of its existence, offered the possibility in its randomness of mislocation of the self, in contradistinction to the grid of precise, rectangular pathways under our feet." Barthelme then goes on to explain how in a world of increasingly specialized training and complex machinery, the simplicity of the balloon is possibly what gave it such relevance. So this is an interpretation essentially based upon consensus, which may seem to you like an essentially un-postmodern idea. But the fact here is that it seems to be a consensus based upon non-consensus. People like the balloon for its ability to change, and for its ability to break free of the patterns that we've imposed to ourselves. The fact that this well-thought-out, detailed interpretation is followed immediately by the narrator's half-baked, hackney psychosexual interpretation of missing his girlfriend makes it seem like this one has more relevancy and that one is even more of an ironic twist. By doing this, Barthelme seems to be coming down on the side of audience interpretation of art, even his own art and stories, even if this interpretation that they come to is not the same as what he intended. He seems to believe that the audience could even come to a more complex conclusion than even the artist himself could.
So then do all postmodernists believe in this?
Not necessarily. To explain this, let's take a look at another story, one produced 10 years after the balloon in 1976, one that explores similar themes to the balloon but comes to a completely different conclusion. This is the story of John Cassavetes' 1976 film, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. The film follows a nightclub owner by the name of Cosmo Vitale. Cosmo's nightclub has two primary acts that take the stage every night. One is a down-on-his-luck, vaudeville-style stand-up comedian by the name of Mr. Sophistication, and the other is a troupe of strippers. A decent portion of the film revolves around these nightclub acts, showing them in detail. Much more detail than most conventional films do. Unsurprisingly, the audience at Cosmo's nightclub has a very different reaction to the two acts, as they love the strippers and are essentially bored by Mr. Sophistication.
If you have any complaints, you just come to me and I'll throw you right out on your ass.
Let's get on with it.
This is Sophistication. Want to assure you...
This is understandably quite vexing to Mr. Sophistication, but Cosmo is also unhappy with the audience's distaste for the comedian and his show as a whole. The title of the film refers to what is given about equal screen time to all of the behind-the-scenes drama at the club. A plot where Cosmo is forced by a group of mobsters to kill a Chinese bookie in order to absolve a gambling debt that is too large for him to pay. After the deed is done, Cosmo returns to the club, and we still have more screen time with the stage show. The girls are still getting all the praise, and Mr. Sophistication is being as unloved as ever, when the movie ends right there, in the middle of one of Mr. Sophistication's performances. Kind of a strange ending if you're not planning on saying anything about the performances, but of course the director is. And this director is John Cassavetes, the godfather of American independent cinema. You may recognize him as an actor from his roles in many popular Hollywood movies of the 60s and 70s, like The Dirty Dozen and Rosemary's Baby. He would act in these larger films and then take the money he made from them and put them directly into his own, smaller, artier, and more independent movies. This film was something of a departure for Cassavetes, whose films were typically straightforward dramas. They were character studies of individual people, families, or a group of unrelated characters. This was different, however, because it was ostensibly a gangster movie, making this one of Cassavetes' only films in a genre other than just drama. But Cassavetes makes it his own, focusing less on the usual tropes of the gangster narrative, and more so focusing on the things that he's interested in, namely the exploration of Cosmo's character, and the time spent behind the scenes and on stage at Cosmo's club. This amount of time spent focusing on the show at the club may feel a little unnatural to some people, especially given that there are just long stretches of scenes where we don't develop any of the characters, we just simply see the act at the club. But this is important. In fact, it might be the most important thing in the movie. It's the key to what Cassavetes is trying to say. But if you were confused by that, don't worry, you're not alone. Lead actor Ben Gazzara was also confused, and after the second day of filming, he got this explanation from the director.
And he was telling me that Cosmo, this man, this ordinary man, his dream, his art, is his club, his show, those girls, those things. And these gangsters epitomized all the people in anyone's life who interfere with your dream, who kill it, you know. And I saw that this picture was not a gangster picture at all. This picture was about John.
So that really puts the whole thing in a new perspective, doesn't it? If Cassavetes is Cosmo, then the club is one of his movies. It's his art. Additionally, the stage show is what we, the audience, see. The way I see it, the dancing girls are like the gangster film tropes within this film. They're an expected comfort, an easy thrill, while Mr. Sophistication stands for the more, well, sophisticated aspects of Cassavetes' filmmaking craft. That would be the studies of the characters, here mostly Cosmo. It's an important part to what Cassavetes is doing, but it's a harder sell to the audience. So if Cosmo is an analog for Cassavetes himself, and the show is an analog for one of his movies, and the audience is an analog for, well, the audience, then what do the mobsters that are destroying Cosmo's dreams represent? Probably producers? While Barthelme put aside a section in his story to lampoon the critics, Cassavetes spends that time taking aim at an external force that Barthelme never would have had to deal with, the producers. While writing fiction is a solitary art form, filmmaking requires numerous people, not to mention expensive camera and lighting equipment, and with this comes the need for money. And with that, producers come in. And Cassavetes doesn't stop at just painting these money men as hacky snobs like Barthelme does with the critics. He paints them as straight up evil. These are mobsters who literally force Cosmo to kill another man. Think about it. Cosmo is gambling with their money, and every time Cassavetes makes a movie, he's gambling with the money he's been given to finance it. If the film does poorly, then whatever investors he may have had essentially lost whatever money they put in. That being said, many of Cassavetes' films were self-financed, like Cosmo's Club is, but in order to make these films, he needed money, and in order to get this money, he acted in other people's movies, not all of which are as critically acclaimed as his own work. The man considered himself an artist. How do you think he felt about being in The Incubus, a film whose script was so bad Cassavetes rewrote 80% of his own dialogue? With this in mind, the titular deed that Cosmo has to perform is perhaps an analog to these actor-for-hire type jobs. Perhaps it's a little dramatic to equate starring in films like The Incubus to literally being forced to kill a person, but both acts were committed in pursuit of the furtherance of the artistic careers of the two men that committed them. So there's something there. And then there's the audience, here personified by the audience at the club. They are, according to the film, impatient, simple creatures who only care about what's an easy pleasure, whatever doesn't require them to think. See, Cassavetes' films were often critically lauded, but they were seldom hits at the box office. And this film, in the irony of ironies, was a hit with neither upon its original release.
The audience was so angry at this film, and truly, even to this day, I don't understand it, but they were coming out of the theater shouting at the people who were lined up waiting to get in. Don't see this movie, this is terrible, save your money. I mean, I'd never experienced that before.
It wasn't until Cassavetes recut the film 2 years later that it started to gain a little bit of a cult following. And I would argue that this has a little bit to do with audience expectation. And I think Cassavetes would not disagree. For one, this film is ostensibly a gangster film, but there's so little of that in there. I think a key scene happens near the end, when Cosmo and Mr. Sophistication and the dancing girls are all in the dressing room at the club. And in this scene, Mr. Sophistication says something that I think is really interesting.
People do come here because I'm, well, some unique kind of personality, I suppose. A bit far out, a bit freakish, maybe, but
Straight-laced.
but freakish, but unique in my own way. And when things go badly, who gets the booing? I do. But when things go well,
Music
they get the applause and all the cheers because they flash their tip.
So, if he is the character study aspects of this film, then he's kind of right. It's a little bit trickier to pull off, and ultimately, when it doesn't work, he gets the blame for it. And when things do work, people will automatically go towards the simpler genre pleasures and give that the credit. But then Cosmo's retort is even more interesting to this scene.
What are you talking? Look how beautiful they are.
Really?
What's wrong with tits?
They loved it. You see, they almost fell off their chairs. It was so great. Are you kidding?
I agree with her.
There's entirely too much comedy.
And
There's
another...
too many.
Alice in Wonderland.
There's
Never too much
this girl
comedy.
here, this new girl.
See, Cosmo seems to care about both parts of his show. He doesn't prioritize Mr. Sophistication over the dancing girls, or vice versa. They're both important parts of his art. See, I think what was most important to Cassavetes was not necessarily whether the film was a character study or if it was a genre picture. It was about personal expression. Cassavetes' films were art films. Many of them are really hard to watch because of the extreme emotionality of them. One would expect a filmmaker like that to denigrate mainstream movies that are special effects heavy, but here's an interview with him where he defends Steven Spielberg's E.T., which was, at the time, the highest grossing film ever made.
Steven Spielberg films in particular, where the actors perhaps may be secondary. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't know. I think they're different. They're totally different. I think that E.T. and Steven's Picture is a marvelous movie, and I don't think it's not about people. I think that's why it's successful. I think it is about people.
See, he thinks it's a wonderful movie. He just likes it when artists express themselves in whatever way they can, whether it's his smaller movies or Spielberg's mega-budget approach. And the audience be damned. Here's Cosmo later in the same scene we've been looking at, talking about how people perceive other people.
A dingbat, right? A ding-a-ling. A dingo. That's what people think she is. Because that's the truth they want to believe. But you put her in another situation, right? Put her in a situation that's tough. Stress, where she's up against something, you see she's no fool.
This doesn't sound like a man who's completely given up on the idea that audiences can have their own interpretation of things. But I do sense a certain bitterness about this film, especially near the end. The film, as I mentioned previously, ends with Mr. Sophistication delivering a song straight to camera and getting no love for it as always. Sophistication goes on for a while, and eventually one of the dancing girls lights a little flame over his shoulder in like a magic trick, and frustrated, Mr. Sophistication walks off stage, ending the film. So, even with all that optimism that I previously stated about self-expression, it seems like Cassavetes does want more people to see his movies. He wants them to enjoy the sophisticated parts of his art, rather than just the basal pleasure. So that's kind of where he and Barthelme differ. Whereas Barthelme sees the audience as very intelligent and able to come to sometimes seemingly more complex interpretations of the art than the artist himself might be, Cassavetes doesn't seem so optimistic.
So who was right then?
On the one hand, I sympathize with Cassavetes. I think more people should see his films and have more patience with them, as many of them are genuinely great, including this one. They're moving, beautiful, realistic character studies that occasionally have a bit of a slow pace. But on the other hand, I too went into Killing of a Chinese Bookie the first time expecting a more straightforward gangster movie, even having seen his previous films. I expected something more akin to The Godfather or Goodfellas, when in reality I got a lot of this.
Raising Cain and hell. Baby.
Needless to say, I was initially disappointed. It was only on subsequent viewings that I was able to create this theory that this video essay is based upon, and really enjoy the film in a slightly different, more postmodern light. Ultimately, I agree with Barthelme on this. When you release a work of art into the world, it no longer belongs solely to you. Yes, it belongs partially to you, and your interpretation matters, but not necessarily more than what the audience takes from it. And just because the audience's beliefs are more simple or more complex than yours does not mean they are not valid.
What do I think about this, then?
I don't know. That's for you to decide. Bye!